Greetings and welcome to the new edition of the VALPRO Path podcast. I am Dusan Chineas from Full Hub, an organization that leads dissemination, communication, and exploitation activities of the VALPRO Path project. And throughout this episode, we'll be presenting the VALPRO Path story map, exploring the details of the European plant protein scene and the solutions that go along with it. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Maeve Henchion from Teagasc, serving as the Work Package 1 leader in the VALPRO Path project. Dr. Henchion is an esteemed expert in plant protein research and innovation. Thank you for joining us.
Delighted to join you. Thank you for the invitation.
Could you please begin by explaining the concept behind this interactive story map and which gaps across all stages of the plant-based protein value chain have you captured?
Sure. Well, in this task, what we really wanted to do was to see what was going on across the whole chain. We know if we want to develop plant-based proteins, it's not enough just to grow it. We also have to think about how is it processed, how is it packaged, how is it brought to market. We have to think about, the inputs, and then we have to think about the final consumer as well. So we have to think along all of those stages. And I suppose when we're thinking across all the legume crops that we covered, we looked at lupins, peas, faba beans, lentils, chickpeas and soybeans. And when you're trying to gather information across all of those stages, across all of those crops, you're going to end up with a huge big tome of a report, which is probably going to sit on a desk and not be of much use. So we decided really what we needed to do was to pull out the key messages, and that was the kind of basis on which we developed the story map. So from that big document that captured all of the information about the gaps at each of the stages for all those crops, we synthesized some key messages that could then be actioned. And I suppose the main point was we were looking at key messages that were specific to legumes rather than crops in general. So for example, one of the gaps that we talk about is the lack of agronomic knowledge and a lot of management experience with growing these crops. So that's something that's quite unique to legumes, but may not be applicable to crops in general across Europe. So that was our focus, to pick out main messages and, as far as possible, issues that were specific to legumes. And then they could, be actioned by policymakers or actioned by private or public bodies along the value chain then.
Yeah, in the part of our value chain are the farmers. So how can European farming systems overcome obstacles or gaps mentioned in this story map, like limited registered grain legume varieties, significant dispersity in registered varieties compared to wheat, and a scarcity of registered plant protection products to maximize the yield stability of protein-rich legumes?
Yes, no, and I think that's a very significant point, and it is a point that's unique to legumes. Kind of again, we deliberately made that comparison to wheat to highlight the fact that we do have a lack of registered varieties for the legumes. And I suppose that the thing is that we have to remember there are a lot of different requirements for varieties across Europe. So in Northern Europe, for example, we need cold tolerant varieties. In Central Europe, where we have a bit more variability, we require varieties that are quite adaptable. In Southern Europe, where there's a lot of drought, you require drought resistant varieties. So in terms of varieties, you need a lot of different types of varieties to cope with the different pedoclimatic regions that are across Europe. But developing varieties requires collaboration by a number of actors. So you need to do research, either in research institutions such as Teagasc or in the universities. You then need to link with seed production companies who will then have contracts with specialized growers to produce these seeds. Then you need, certification by the ministries of agriculture in the various countries as well. Then you need, the marketing and sales as well. So you need private companies to come on board as well. So you need public and private actors to work together. And we have that within VALPRO Path. We do have plant breeding companies working with universities and the research institutions to develop more varieties. And that's a very specific aspect of VALPRO Path. And it's, I suppose, one of the interesting aspects of Horizon Europe funded projects, where you have that multi-actor approach and you have the different actors coming together. So I suppose that's it. Like, you need the various actors coming together. You need the knowledge from research. You need the farmers and their knowledge and expertise coming together. And then you need the private companies coming together. And I think that model is required for most of the solutions that exist within the value chain. It's not a single actor that's going to resolve it. It's not a particular type of expertise or knowledge. It's all of the different actors coming together to develop those solutions.
Yeah, and from your point of view, what have you learned about cultivation and production phase? Where are the gaps there?
I suppose again it's similar to the varieties, the different varieties that are required for different zones. Different crops have their own different requirements as well. So for example, some are very tolerant of acidity, some are less tolerant, some are more tolerant of drought and waterlogging, and some aren't. So lupins, for example, even though like most legumes, it can fix nitrogen, it doesn't it thrives in nutrient poor soil, but other crops such as peas, they require more fertile soil. So I think that's the whole thing about cultivation and production as well. You need to really understand your crop, you need to understand its needs, and one of the kind of messages that agronomists would always say, you need to have the right crop for the right soil in the right area. So that's the kind of the key challenge. All of these crops can be grown very well, but they have to be put into the appropriate field with the appropriate soil type, the appropriate level of acidity, the appropriate level of fertility, and then you have to consider, water logging, drought, all of those pedoclimatic things as well. But definitely we need to do a lot more kind of on the education, advice, and training to upskill farmers. And again, though, I suppose recognizing that it's not just the advisors in the public sector that are relevant here, it is the input suppliers as well. And also we know from our own work here in Teagasc, it's learning from other farmers, that's critical as well, and having demonstrations and peer-to-peer learning. And I suppose that's part of the work that we'll be doing within VALPRO Path as well, as demonstrating how these varieties can be grown in practice and helping people to hear from farmers who are growing these crops. So it demonstrates that these things can be grown in practice and successfully grown by farmers who are quite similar to themselves. So it's not something that, it is possible to do, but you do need to know what you're doing, I suppose.
And given your expertise in agronomy and your focus on innovation in sustainable food production, could you elaborate on how the scarcity of agronomy expertise adversely affects yield optimization and innovation?
Yeah, so I suppose it's not just that it affects yield, it affects things like quality. And we know as well, there's one kind of standard of quality with regards to feed for animal purposes. But when we're thinking about food, we're thinking about growing these plants for food, which is one of the main focuses in VALPRO Path. We have other quality requirements as well. So, you need to ensure that the seed looks good, but you also need to look at, you know, things like bitterness. So lupin can be a little bit bitter, and you can have food processing technologies that can address that. But really, it's probably better if you can, get an appropriate variety in the first instance to reduce that. So there's lots of work that can be done really to improve those kind of things. And we did some work looking at the gaps in the yield potential across crops in different countries, and the gap between potential yield and actual yield can be 50, 60, 70%. And that's a real challenge. And I suppose when you think about farmers and whether they are interested in growing these crops or not, it's all very well to say you can produce X tons per hectare, but that's the potential yield. The actual yield um, is very different as a result of management practices and giving them appropriate advice and education and training. So you can have a variety that has outstanding yield potential and outstanding quality attributes, but unless the management matches that, and you have a bit of luck with regards to weather, that gap in yield potential is a real issue for farmers. But it's a lot of it is down to management and education and training around that.
Yeah, and Dr. Henchion, considering food technologies integration with plant-based ingredients, what constraints currently exist and how do they affect sensory attributes, functionality, and sustainability?
Yeah, well, I suppose some of the food technologies that we use for plant-based protein are quite simple. We've had dried peas, dried lentils, we've had those types of technologies around for many years. But I suppose where there's a little bit more innovation in recent times is when we've been extracting proteins from crops. And we still face some challenges with regards to some flavors. So, for example, pea can have a particular flavor that needs to be masked when it's put into plant-based protein powder, for example. Color is another thing, particularly with regards to pea, that needs to be masked. And then I mentioned the bitterness with the lupins already as well. So there are a number of kind of sensory attributes that need to be addressed. So color, taste, texture, aroma, all of those standard ones need to be addressed. And I suppose it also then depends on the market that you're aiming for. So if you're aiming to produce something that mimics a meat or a dairy product, the sensory aspects are particularly important. Whereas if you're trying to encourage people to eat more whole plants, like peas and beans and legumes in their entirety, the sensory aspects are a little bit different because you're not trying to mimic something. You're trying to, that they're evaluated on their own right, as opposed to comparing them to what we think, a steak or a milk or dairy products. So the benchmarks are a little bit different depending on the market in which you're trying to sell them as well.
Yeah, yes. And within the story map, you highlighted the presence of communication gaps considering labeling, marketing standards, and brands. Could you offer specific examples of these gaps and maybe propose potential solutions for addressing them?
Yeah, so I suppose, when you're trying to define what a vegan product is or what a vegetarian product is, that's not always straightforward. And you're depending on various regulatory bodies to give those definitions, and they're not standard. And I suppose there's been a lot of regulatory challenges to the use of the words like meat or dairy in plant-based products as well. So some of those things have been resolved a little bit, but they have caused a lot of confusion for consumers in trying to understand what are they actually buying. Are they buying a dairy alternative or a meat-like product, or are they buying a plant beverage? Are they buying a product that's suitable for vegans or vegetarians? And there's been a lot of confusion around that space. But there is work being done on it, but it is a cause for confusion. And then I suppose for people to understand and part of their broader diet whether plant-based is better for them or not better for them, there's a lot of confusion around those kind of aspects as well.
Yeah. And what lies behind consumer knowledge gaps and inconsistent retailer promotions? And what measures can be taken to address these challenges, thereby improving the recognition of the distinctive attributes of plant-based proteins?
Yeah, I suppose I think about the work that's been done in the past trying to promote, say, the organic sector. And when you looked at the retailers and how they used to position organic in the past, they had s- small sections of organics in, trying to compare them to the conventional products. And the whole identity of organics often got lost. So when we think about plant-based products, obviously you have them in your fruit and vegetable section, but then do you position them next to your meat products and your dairy products, or do you give them a category into their by themselves? And I think those kinds of decisions have, again, I suppose, resulted in a lack of clarity for consumers, and I suppose that then kind of I suppose a lack of clear positioning of those types of products as well. So there's more kind of thinking to be done around those types of issues.
And as we wrap up, Dr. Henchion, let's discuss the impact of increasing plant-based protein consumption on Europeans' food landscape. How are stakeholders adapting, and what changes are essential for a sustainable future?
Yeah, I suppose when we think about the stakeholders, we see lots of changes. Well, like the processors, I suppose, are the main ones. We see a lot of new startup companies. We see a lot of companies that would traditionally have been meat and dairy companies positioning themselves now as protein companies as opposed to meat or dairy companies. We also see the development of hybrid products. So there's a lot of interesting kind of trends there. Um, On the consumer side, I suppose we do see a growth in flexitarians. The growth in vegetarians and vegans is a little bit more modest, and actually it's very interesting because there was some nice research done in the EU funded project called Smart Protein, and they did a survey of consumers, and they found that whether you're an omnivore or a vegetarian, how you perceive barriers to increasing plant-based consumption are a little bit different. So they found, for example, that omnivores are more likely to score higher in barriers relating to, for example, a belief that they need to eat lots of animal-based meat, an expectation that plant-based foods may not be tasty, and maybe that they may not enjoy such products. So there is a difference with regards to how they see these barriers. And the conclusion of that paper was that we should focus our communication efforts on consumers with different types of food lifestyles. So you would have a particular communication campaign for omnivores, a particular communication campaign for flexitarian, and a particular communication campaign for vegans and vegetarians, because they perceive different barriers, even though they may face the same barriers. How they perceive these barriers and how they interact with them is different. So that was kind of a nice recommendation that came out of that. I suppose looking at policymakers, we can see some trends there with regards to some governments really stepping up to promote plant-based production and consumption. I think Denmark developed kind of a roadmap to increasing plant-based consumption there last year. Germany has made significant investments with regards to promoting plant-based production, and has invested a lot in developing a competence centre, and has invested a lot in kind of promoting the production of those types of crops as well. So, looking across the various stakeholders, there has been lots of change. And you've also seen, a lot of or other organizations stepping in to be advocates and supporting them, like the Good Food Institute, for example. They do a lot of work to promote not just plant-based protein, but alternative proteins as well. And there's obviously a lot of developments in that broader landscape as well.
Well, thank you, Dr. Henchion, for joining us, and thank you for tuning in into the VALPRO Path podcast. Visit our website to access the complete story map by clicking on the button located on our homepage. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content. Stay connected, and if you have any ideas or suggestions for topics you would like us to cover, please reach out to us through our social media channels.